The events last Saturday in Charlottesville, Virginia. The responses given by many to those events have prompted many of us in these past 8 days to reflect on them, on the state of our nation, the state of racial relations in our country, the reality of racism and bigotry, not to mention a discussion of what freedom of speech means when it is stretched to its very limits. No doubt this has been a very, very difficult week for our nation and likely for many of you. As people of faith, it is our natural response when things like this occur for us to ask, what does our faith teach? What does it say? Does it have a word for us about these events that might tell us how we respond to what is going on? Can we see what happens today and respond with our faith from of old? We might even ask, does our faith, does our religion, our traditions, our values, do they have anything to say to things such as these? I believe they do. I think not only does our faith have something to say, it has something for us to think and to put into action as well. I believe in my heart of hearts that our faith instructs us clearly on what we as people of faith ought to do with our actions, not just with the words of our mouth. We spoke last week about beliefs and about how beliefs were not enough, that we needed to take our beliefs a step further and put them into action, to share them with others, to tell people what we value and why. I believe those words are truer now today, even more than they were last Sunday. So at the outset, I want to reflect for a moment on something I mentioned last Sunday. I spoke about an essay series called This I Believe. I indicated that this series, it began in the 1950s. It was revived in the early 2000s. It has prompted over 100,000 people from all over the world, all walks of life, to write essays about their deepest held values and beliefs and how those values and beliefs show up in their everyday living. One of my strongest held beliefs, in fact, I would say it is maybe second only to my convictions of my faith, is freedom of speech. I do not believe it is an accident that it was part of the First Amendment, that it is found in the same protections that afford us the right to worship God as we see fit, the freedom of the press, the freedom of peaceable assembly, and the freedom, when we think our government gets it wrong, to redress that in public and peaceful means. It is not too much to say, I do not think, that our system of government, if there is not freedom of speech, can only be thought of as a dictatorship. Moreover, I believe that free speech does not mean only popular speech. That is where our nation has always struggled. What happens when the speech is vile? What happens when it is sinful? What happens when it is an assault on common decency? What happens when 99.99% of the nation says that is despicable? Is that still protected speech? What about when it says something we don't like? What about when that speech offends us? What happens when it makes us uncomfortable? The reality is we know far too well. We know what happens when fears override the ability to protect free speech. Now, I want to be clear. I believe in free speech. In fact, I believe that the peaceful, that word is very important, the peaceful members of the Aryan Nation, the Ku Klux Klan, the Nazi Party, Stormfront, National Alliance, any other hate-spewing white supremacist group, they have every right to believe what they believe and to say what they believe as long as they say it peaceably. That's a hard pill for me to swallow, because if you haven't picked up on it, There is nothing in those groups I believe in, nothing in those groups I would ever support, other than they have the right to say it. But equally, I have just as much a right, and we all do, just as much a right to say what I think about those organizations. I have just as much right to say their beliefs are un-American. They betray our best values as Americans. They are cowards. They are anti-Christian. And it makes me angry that they use the faith that is so dear to me to support their hate beliefs. I have a right to say that. You have a right to say that. We even have an obligation, I would say, to stand up and say, not in my name, not in my faith's name, not in my God's name. So, while we cannot and should not limit the hateful and unpopular speech of white supremacists, our freedom of speech gives us a freedom to respond. And we can respond in a lot of ways. We can do nothing. Just because we have the freedom of speech doesn't mean we have to say what we think. We can ignore it. We can say nothing. Sometimes silence does speak much louder than the words that we would use. We can do what many have done and use our right to speech to counter what they say. When we silence speech, any type of speech, we betray our own values as a country. Men and women for hundreds of years have died. Even now, they are fighting now for these values. And when we limit that speech, we are no better than those countries and those regimes we have stood up against throughout history. As the grandson of a man who wore the uniform of the United States Army, who served in Nazi-occupied Europe, I think it is disgusting that Americans wave that damn swastika flag. I hate that flag. I hate it. But that 92-year-old man in a nursing home in Arizona, he served so people could do that. But he also served so I could say no. I don't believe what you believe. One thing our freedom of speech does not permit us, however, is to turn that speech into mob action, to incite others to violence, into calls for attacking others in any way, but especially separating people and eliminating people. Now, certainly I think and would hope we can all agree, and I'll be honest, I don't know what to say if we can't agree on this point, but I think we can agree professing hate speech is one thing. You may not like it, but frankly, others may not like what we have to say. But that is one thing. Turning a vehicle into a weapon and killing people is not protected speech, and it must be stood up and called what it is: evil. Our faith, our Christian faith and heritage, it is clear there are ways to speak and to respond as Christians to these realities and to challenging times. Our Christian history is full of men and women, brave men and women who have stood up and done some of the most incredible, beautiful, powerful things in human history. Because of our faith, we are right to lift up those heroes, those examples. But the shameful reality is that far too often, good people of good faith have done and said nothing. Even at times, the very church has been complicit in perpetuating evil by not talking about it, by not standing against it, or even, at its very worst, actually giving credence to it. Paul, in our reading just a short while ago, he's wrapping up a really long train of thought that tells us this idea of who is in and who is out, who is on the inside, who is on the outside, who are the good people, who are the bad people. This debate is long before today or last week or our generation or our country. And Paul, interestingly, is on both sides of this Jewish-Gentile thing. Who are the most happy? Who are the people that make God happy? Who are the people that God calls his own? And Paul brings it back to the word all. Just what does all mean? What are the implications of his writing a few chapters earlier in chapter 8 when he closes that and says, there is nothing that can separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus? What if our assumptions are wrong? What about our misdeeds? We've all done them. What about if we want to do everything possible to say, no, God, I don't want this? Is that enough to make it where we are not able to receive God's grace? Is that enough? If we take Paul seriously with his words in chapter 11, the answer is no. Even in our opposition to God, even in something that profound, God is bigger. God's grace is bigger than even that. God is able to use even our own opposition to God and God's purposes to bring about grace. It's kind of insane. But it is so awesome that God's grace, that God's mercy, that God's good news is bigger, that the circles we draw to say these are the good and the right and the accepted people, no matter how big we draw them, God always draws them bigger. God's circle, God's acceptance, God's grace and mercy are so much bigger than our own. And Paul is equally clear earlier in the book of Romans, chapter 3, about why this is. Because all of us, and there's that word again, all of us fall short of God's glory. None of us is righteous, not one. If we take that all seriously, that convicting word, that word of condemnation, and Christianity always has, it is all. We have to take this all later about how God uses even that to show God's glory and mercy and wonders. That's a pretty convicting word, because those of us who might thumb our nose at Nazis, really in God's calculus, we're no better than a Nazi. We're no better than homosexuals. We're no better than liberals. We're no better than conservatives. We're no better than Cardinals fans. We're no better than Steelers fans. We're no better than people who listen to jazz music or people who listen to heavy metal music. Or whatever group we say, yeah, those people are just a little too far out. God says, I will have none of that, and neither should you. So if we all take seriously in chapter 3, and Christianity has, we have to take that all in chapter 11 seriously as well. But we as people, as humans, we are wired so well to hate, to separate, to hate people who look different than us, or talk different than us, or think different than us, or believe different than us, or worship different than us. But God has none of it. No, ours is a faith that says our rights, our privileges, our benefits, our blessings, we should set them aside, because there's people who don't have those things. And those are the people we are called to stand with. People without power, privilege, respect, honor. We take what measure we have of those things and we give them away. We step them aside, but that is completely contrary to human nature. Why would we put someone else ahead of us? It's fine to bring them up to the same level of us, but to put them ahead of ourselves, that's what God calls us to do. God's word of love, of mercy, of grace, it is an incredibly blessed word to us. It tells all of us who are undeserving of those things of God that there's nothing we can do to still not receive them. But it is probably the hardest word for us to hear, because it works against our self-interest. Who wants to go without? But our faith is an outward-looking and outward-giving faith. So I would like to talk about what our response looks like by looking at someone, actual person from history. Our confirmation class that finished up last May, they've actually heard of this individual. And now those who were in that class, I know, are thinking, okay, which one of them people that he told us about is he talking about? It's all right. Because even they may not actually remember this name, but they'll remember what he helped write. His name, this man's name, is Martin Niemöller. Martin Niemöller is a pretty complicated guy. Now, there's a lot of ways I could describe him. Martin Niemöller is German. He's German. He's born, lived his whole life in Germany. He was a Lutheran pastor, just as his father before him was. Martin Niemöller was an academic. He was smart, but he was also an incredible pastor. He gave these incredibly powerful sermons that moved people to action. Niemöller lived for 7 years, from 1938 to 1945, in various concentration camps. In fact, he only left in 1945 when Allied forces liberated the Dachau concentration camp where he was living. Hitler didn't like him. He put him in a camp. Confirmation students, do you remember what he wrote? The Theological Declaration of Barmen, one of our denomination's statements of faith. It's in our book of confessions. It was written in 1934. It helped establish the Confessing Church. Niemöller had an organization right before then because he didn't believe that the church should be the propaganda arm of the Nazi Party, and Hitler and his leaders did. He took a stand against that and said, no, that's not okay. That is not right. And this eventually evolved into what is called the Confessing Church, who wrote this document. It's a church that arose in Germany that stood against the Third Reich. It opposed their co-opting of the German Lutheran State Church. Many of its members, like Niemöller, were imprisoned in the 30s and early 40s. Many of its members, like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, lost their lives for standing against the Third Reich. Many others were forced to live in exile, so they actually even had the ability to have a resistance movement. But perhaps the way most people, even those outside this confirmation class, know Niemöller outside of Germany, outside of the German Lutheran Church, is one of his most famous quotes. And he gave it in so many ways, and he substituted different words and phrases that there's no real way to know what the exact words were, because he always kind of changed them a little bit. But the spirit remains. These words actually appear above the entrance to the United States Holocaust Memorial. This quote, or a version of it, goes like this. First, they came for the socialists, but I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. The tie-in with freedom of speech, the haunting concluding words of this sentiment. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. These haunting and powerful words remind us of the power and responsibility that words have, especially words that go unspoken. We must, as people of faith, we must always stand against hatred and bigotry, nationalism, tribalism, racism, all other forms, any form of hate and separation that is used to separate people and set them against each other. Division, alienation, hatred is never God's value. When God has chosen people, has chosen groups, it was never to say because they are better or more superior. When God said, I choose the nation of Israel, it wasn't because Israel was great and wonderful. Far from it. Read the Old Testament. They got it plenty wrong. They were chosen so that through them, through that imperfect vessel, God would bring the entire world to know this God of grace and mercy and blessing. When God sets us aside for a purpose, it's not because we're great. It's because God is trying to use us to bring others to God's self. But that is not the end. That would be too easy. Many of us, if not all of us, can probably get on board with doing away with racism. I think we can all agree, at least at an intellectual level, racism is bad. That we ought to speak words of love instead of hate. We can all see, for the most part, I would think, that when your best spokespeople are skinheads, the Ku Klux Klan, and David Duke, maybe it is time to think about getting better spokespeople. But that too would be very easy. Do you recall when I said, when speaking of Niemöller, that he was a really complicated guy? Remember how I described him, all the things about him? Pretty decent guy, right? But we're all complicated. We're a big bag of good and bad. Not either or, but both and. Niemöller served in the Prussian Navy. That is, he commanded a U-boat for the Kaiser during World War I. Quite likely, he launched torpedo attacks that killed Americans. When ordered by the Allies as the terms of peace to surrender his boat and all of its crew, he refused and steamed his U-boat back to Germany. During the 1920s, as Germany literally was crushed by the terms of the Versailles Treaty that ended World War I, he believed, as he was studying and ordained as a pastor, that what Germany needed was a good, strong leader who would put Germany first. That's why he voted for Adolf Hitler twice. He would have probably voted for Hitler more than twice, but he only had 2 opportunities to do so. He voted for Adolf Hitler and the German National Socialist Workers' Party, the Nazi Party. In fact, although he objected to Hitler's use of the church for propaganda, he supported anti-Semitism. He even preached it out of his own pulpit for years. He was a strong supporter of Hitler until 1938. If you remember, that's the year that finally Hitler had too much and decided to shut him up in a concentration camp. Those famous words of Niemöller's, those words that have inspired people for well over 50 years, they were not written in the 1930s or the 1940s. They weren't even written in Germany. It was only in touring the United States in the 50s that those words came about, when it surrounded the publication of a novel called The Diary of a Young Girl. We all know who wrote that, Anne Frank. It was not until the end of World War II that Niemöller would explicitly condemn not only the interference with the state church, but would actually condemn anti-Semitism and genocide. He wrote these great, moving, powerful words. But he was a conflicted guy. He was a complicated guy. So are we. We are complicated people. Now, Niemöller did do something even more powerful. He spent a significant portion of his later life, and he lived until 1984. He lived about half of his life after World War II. He spent that portion of his life speaking about his own errors, how he got it wrong, how he was led to perpetuate hate and evil in his earlier life. So no, hating the hater, yelling louder than the people we disagree with, which I will admit at times is necessary, that is not enough. Many this past week, they've asked the provocative question: if Jesus Christ was in Charlottesville, Virginia last Saturday, which side would Jesus stay with? Which group would he have demonstrated with? The overwhelming answer people have given to that is, well, he would have sided with the counter-protesters, and they would be right. Jesus always stood with those who were attacked, those who were on the margins of society, those who were persecuted. In fact, I believe Jesus not only would have physically stood in place, but I believe in a real sense Jesus already has stood in the place in front of Heather Heyer, the woman killed in that attack last Saturday, taking her place, because that is what Jesus does. But that too is too simple, or rather, it's incomplete. Because I believe Jesus, for reasons I can't always wrap my mind around, I believe Jesus would have stood with the alt-right, with skinheads, with Klansmen, with Nazis. Because it is easy to reach out and to help and to support and to stand with the people that we support and agree with, that we believe in, that we believe have the right sorts of ideas. But how seriously do we really take that word all? Jesus welcomes all. Jesus welcomes skinheads. Jesus welcomes Nazis. Jesus welcomes the confused people who know things are not good for them, and maybe these people do, maybe they're onto something, maybe they have the right idea. But Jesus would never leave it right there. Jesus would have talked. Jesus would have listened. Jesus would have ministered, would have healed, would have called them, I believe, to a new way of life. And so should we. It is easy to say, I disagree with you, boo on you. It is a whole other level to step in and do that hard work of change. I hate, and I don't use that word lightly, I hate everything about the ideology of white supremacy. I have no problem yelling or being heard. I have one of those voices. Ask my children. But do I have the conviction to do more than just talk? Do I have the conviction to do more? To see my commitment through when the actions are demanding, when I don't like them, when they are hard, when they are downright impossible. Marvin Gaye said it. Rather, he sang it best. Only love can conquer hate. We must be people who not only shout love, but live love for all. Sometimes that means standing with others who need someone to stand with them. Sometimes it's shouting with people who need to have that message amplified. Sometimes it means listening even when we don't want to. It's easy to protect free speech when we agree with it, but we don't really believe in free speech if we don't also believe in it for those whose thoughts and beliefs and words we despise. Sometimes we have to let our actions speak, as they always do, louder than our words. Brennan Manning, he's now deceased, was a Roman Catholic priest. He's an alcoholic. He was also a Christian rabble-rouser. He always had ways of talking about the faith that really made people kind of uncomfortable. He knew a thing or two, though, about being on the outs, because he always found himself on the outs, wherever he was when he was a little child growing up in an Irish neighborhood in New York, when he served in the army in World War II, watched his best friend from childhood literally jump on a grenade with a smile on his face as that final act of love. He knew what it was to be on the outs when his drinking got in the way of his ministry and his relationships. But because of that, like Paul would say, he knew the God of grace found and seen in Jesus Christ. In relating God's word for today, he writes this: the outstretched hands of Jesus Christ. The outstretched hands of Jesus exclude no one. Not the drunk in the street, gays and lesbians in their isolation, the most selfish and ungrateful in their cocoons, the most unjust of employers, the most overweening of snobs. Put your own words in there. The most hateful white supremacist. people who believe things we just can't even imagine. The love of Christ, he concludes, the love of Christ embraces all without exception. Loving those like us, that is easy. Paul's word to us today, the world's deep need, the need that, quite frankly, we're going to see needed again and again far too soon, asks us not to do the easy thing, but do the hard thing. But hey, if this was easy, everybody would do it, wouldn't they? What will you do?